And quick as a flash, we were live and direct on the Midday Show. Hello, good afternoon. Welcome. This is Neil Long, and I'm really looking forward to doing this today because I'm actually talking to an old friend, an old colleague, well, not old, a former, I should use, colleague of mine. I can see her on screen go, oh, that's close, Longie, that's close. You know what I mean. A former colleague of mine at Capital Radio, which is so cool. But she's been on one hell of a, as we all have been on one hell of a journey, or a voyage, maybe I should say, since then. And going to be really digging deep, having a good old deep dive into a subject that really does interest me today, because we're just trying to do a bit of mental health and psychology on quite a few Wednesdays here on the Midday Show. So I'm going to bring her on in just a moment. We'll do some hellos though. Who have we got watching? It's going to be one of those shows today, by the way, where you probably will have a ton of questions, and feel free to put them in the chat, and I will put them to Lou LeBence, our guest. Hello.
Hello, Neil.
You haven't changed at all.
Oh my goodness! Really?
Really?
Wow! How many years ago was it?
Now let me just work it out.
I think it's at least 25 years ago, if not a bit longer.
I joined Capital in 95.8 and left in 2001.
Yeah. So it was definitely in that section of time. And where are we today? 2025. So it's probably 25 to 28 years ago. Gosh, maybe we were very young.
I know. You honestly, you look and sound exactly the same. I don't. My hair's a different colour now.
Oh, well, you see, yeah, that's the difficulty of being female male. I mean, mine obviously isn't quite au naturel. Maybe I would be grey if I didn't dye it.
No, I tried dyeing it and it just didn't work. I looked like a reject from Benidorm, so it was just like not even worth doing.
Do people still call you Longie?
They do, yeah. Some people from that era, you can call me Longie. I'm good with that, or Neil, or a myriad of other things that people call me. Some more polite than others. Let's just go back. You were Lou LeBence from Events.
I was Lou LeBence from Events. Yes,
and you worked with Charlotte, if I remember rightly.
I worked with Charlotte. I did. Lovely. I can't remember
her surname.
It's Brighton now. I can't remember what it was at the time. Yeah, and Karina. Do you remember Karina? Lovely Reenie Martin.
Vaguely.
Dark hair, yeah. And Kate was there, and I was there at the time of Dominic and Adrian. And
so I remember doing the road shows with you as well, because you would come out to the Capital Rig, the rig gigs we used to call them, and I would go on stage and you
do you remember that?
Running it all, and it was just fascinating. Then I suppose we went our own separate ways for a while, and you came back on my radar when I found out you were in the therapeutic business, and I read your story, and it's an incredible story. You never know what I mean. When I knew you at Capital, I had no idea of the stuff that you
been through. Yeah, just quite recently to Capital as well. I think it was. Yeah, I think it was literally 2 years prior to Capital, I'd had my psychotic break. So I'd already been sectioned and kind of a mental health crisis before. And then I went into Capital and managed to, I think, more or less hold it together for a few years. And then
I held it together, because I remember you clearly. And it's like people saying, oh, it doesn't look like there's anything wrong with you, which is a really callous way of saying it, but it didn't. You did hold it together really well. We call it I describe it as putting a mask on, and we're all very good at doing it. But the problem is, if what isn't processed, what needs to be processed, isn't processed, I've learned the mask will crack, and then it will come off at sometimes the most inconvenient times.
Yep. It did, and I suppose I kind of held it together for the radio bit, and then after I left Capital, well, I actually got headhunted by Heart, so I went and helped set up Heart 106.2, if you remember.
I do. I remember the very early iterations of Heart. I do.
Yeah. And then I left radio to go and help my mother, who was up a mountain in Italy with my then alcoholic stepfather.
Right.
Yeah, and it kind of took a couple of years and getting him into treatment, etc., etc. And when I came back, I didn't want to go back into radio or anything like that. And prior to radio, I'd also been in the rag trade. I'd been in the fashion industry and
Yeah.
worked for, like, Philip Green and all the rest of it. So
Wow.
I didn't want to go back into that. So I got into the health and fitness industry first when I came back from Italy at about 33, 34, mainly because I didn't know what I wanted to do. I really didn't.
Did you
And
like radio? You seemed seemed to love it. But there again, I was just young and giddy. I was a young kid with my dream job, so I'd
yeah,
assumed that everyone. I was sort of projecting my stuff onto everyone else. Going, oh, everyone must love this, but maybe you didn't. I don't know.
I did, and I was in my 20s then, and it was great fun. And I remember trying to be the kind of sidekick to Chris Tarrant for a while and being the
Yeah.
guinea pig on, and I loved all of that. I mean, what was it? Great face for radio, he used to say to me,
The
And
thing is, though, getting insulted by Chris Tarrant was the most desired thing. Because if I think he called me the fat overnight DJ once, but I was delighted and it was
yeah,
probably true on both
yeah,
counts. But I was delighted because that's like promotion on the breakfast show at Capital. That was
yeah,
big.
yeah,
I'm like,
exactly.
insult me all you want,
And I loved it because I love music. So I've always loved music, and music's kind of quite a big part of my life. But I think I got into my early 30s, and even though I went and worked for Heart, I don't know, maybe it was my history already catching up with me or starting to, but I think I wanted a career that was more people orientated. And then with the alcoholic stepfather and all of that, and up Italy, it obviously planted a seed that when I came back, I started doing training in like hypnotherapy and NLP and loads of other things. But I eventually did a 6 months training at the Priory in Bristol and decided that I wanted to look at addictions, really, not knowing that I probably could have qualified for a treatment stint at the Priory myself, because I don't know whether you remember, I was rather partial to Pinot Grigio, even in my days at Capital.
I don't remember that, actually. That's one bit
Yeah,
I don't remember, to be honest.
yeah. So anyway, eventually I kind of got into recovery and stopped drinking and got a job at the Priory and in treatment. And then I spent 10 years of my early career in therapy at the Priory in Roehampton.
Which is that was the kind of, for the benefit of people watching, the kind of place, it had this kind of association where all the showbizy people went to detox, didn't it?
Yes.
It had this kind of, you might have seen Robbie Williams there kind of thing.
Yes.
It wasn't entirely like that. It just had that kind of association to it, didn't
And I
it?
suppose that there was a bit of a thread through putting people on stage at Capital and doing all the parties in the park and the road shows that we used to do, and then seeing people in a completely different format, because I was putting them into a treatment program rather than anything else. So maybe
I used to have an agent back then, and he had this theory that everyone in showbiz was a bit screwed up in some way. He said it tends to attract this type, and I think he was kind of right in what he said. Also, what I noticed, because I did NLP too, I can talk about swish patterns and submodalities till the cows come home, But when I was doing the NLP, very strange noise coming from my other room. I've got my girlfriend's oldest daughter here and her mate, and I've told them to be quiet while I'm on the show.
Oh, brilliant. I notice, is that your Christmas tree behind you as well?
I'm kind of eccentric and lazy, so I like twinkly things. So
yes.
Yeah, I've got a bit more eccentric as I've got older.
You plan to have it up all year? Is it going to remain?
August was my best.
Okay, good. Yeah.
That was my best. So that was a real tree. So when I moved it, all the needles went at once. It was like a kind of cartoon moment where they all fell off. So when I did NLP, what I found was a lot of people there were quite wounded people trying to sort of vicariously heal their own lives by healing other people. But what what is going on in there? But sorry about that. But sounds like they're dragging something across the floor. I hate to think. Anyway, I'll be a professional and focus on the show.
Yeah.
If the whole house collapses, forgive me. But what I found was with any kind of work like this, it all begins with ourselves, doesn't it? Anything, any personal development, any healing. And
Yeah.
sometimes we need support with. I've got a whole bunch of questions. Go
on. Okay. And I think going back to your point about are all people that are in the profession in some way troubled. I think that there are many of us and many people that seek love and appreciation and through ulterior means that maybe they didn't get. So I do think it kind of pulls that kind of person into the profession.
You're right. It does come back to that because it is addictive, getting that love, getting positive regard and all that sort of thing. The thing is, though, as I've learned, the showbiz industry is the worst place to look for that.
Yeah, it is totally.
It's just about the worst place because it's full of people looking for that rather than wanting to give it. And I love performing. I mean, to this day, I do stand-up comedy and I do radio still, and I still love it. But I wouldn't look to get my emotional needs fulfilled there particularly, apart from the buzz of being on stage, which is great. But I wouldn't call that fulfilling in a.
No,
that wouldn't be a complete emotional set of needs fulfilled for me.
Yeah, no, it definitely doesn't, unfortunately. And when it's not there, or you've done a not great show, or something's not worked, of course, then the activation and the triggers from that, because you're not getting the love and everything that you want from it.
And it's like constantly chasing a loss, isn't it? So you struggle more, but in struggling more, you tend to struggle more. The more you struggle more, and it gets into a bit of a vicious circle. And then people develop addictions to feel better. You must have seen that so much in the Priory, I guess.
Yeah, I did, and all different hosts and different types of addictions too. And sometimes we get addicted to a myriad of things to kind of either up-regulate ourselves or down-regulate ourselves. So
so you're doing incredible work nowadays in the field
of
trauma.
I've been a therapist for 20 I mean, this is how long ago. I think I've been a therapist for over 20 years.
Wow.
So, I mean, after I was at the Priory for a decade, I then spent another decade in private practice before I even wrote The Voyage or started to do what I'm doing now. So I've been in therapy a lot longer than I've been in radio.
Tell us about The Voyage, because this is really good stuff. I'll just precede it by saying I saw your email the other day, which you sent out to people on your mailing list, including me, and you said the word trauma is it's become a buzzword. It's and we go through. I've noticed human beings, we go through phases like that. There's a buzzword du jour. The last one being narcissism, I think. Now it's trauma. You're right, but there's so much more to it than just the latest buzzword. It's a real thing, isn't it? And I think as a society, I hope we're becoming more aware. I hear the term trauma-informed therapist quite a lot nowadays. But tell us all about your work, Lou. This is why we got you here. I want to hear all about it.
Okay, well, how do I precede it other than saying, for 20 years, I was very fortunate in that I worked with people in private healthcare who had the funds and the resources to do their healing journey. And I know with my own healing journey that I basically kind of bankrupt myself to pay for my healing. And I know that it used to crucify me, Neil, for years, that I would speak to so many inquiries at the Priory of people that didn't have the funds to send their loved one into treatment or get any.
Cheap, was it?
No, it's really not cheap. And so I suppose over my 2 decades, I kind of started to think, firstly, is there a way of creating something that is affordable and accessible to more than people that have got the funds for treatment? So that's part one of what was always been in my head. I'm not quite there yet, but I'm going to get there. Even if it kills me, I'm going to get there. And part two was the incredible lack of trauma-informedness that I found throughout my own personal journey and professional journey, in that Trauma was never part of my training. I never learned about it. It was never discussed. And it wasn't really until 5 or 6 years into my career as a therapist on the addiction treatment program at the Priory that trauma even came into my ether. It just was not mentioned. And when it did, it was
and
like...
yet it's the basis of all of it, isn't it? It's like the core bit. It's like
totally
the elephant in the room, surely.
Totally. You know, because if we even say that trauma is actually a dysregulated nervous system, and trauma is not about big one-off events that happen to you, that's not the basis of trauma, then we look at actually a dysregulated nervous system and some form of trauma. And let me quantify, there are many different forms, and I can tell you about those 4 forms and how I see what trauma is, sits underneath every mental health presentation that I've ever worked with or seen. Or any.
So do you think a lot of mental health treatment is a bit kind of surface level, like cutting the grass without pulling the root out?
Yeah, totally. I think it's all sticky plaster. It all works with the symptoms. It doesn't work with the causes. And so 14 years ago or so, I started to go, actually, sorry, in my own journey and psychosis and addiction and everything else, and in everybody that I work with, what the common denominator underlying it all is trauma.
Yeah.
And so actually what we need is we need to be treating the trauma and the dysregulation within the body and the nervous system and working out what has happened to this person in their life to create the symptoms that they are now seeing and experiencing.
See, I want to break this down. I want to understand the 4 types of trauma.
Okay.
I understand that the body holds onto it. Isn't there that wonderful book? I think Gabor Mate might have written it. Is it the body keeps? No, he did. Did he write The Body Keeps the Score? I'm on the right lines here.
Gabor wrote When the Body Says No. Bessel van der Kolk wrote.
That's right.
The body, keeps the score.
But basically, it's kind of issues stored in the tissues, if I may. And until that's processed and released, and the mind and body are connected, it's going to be like a weight holding you down, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I read quite from a lady. She was a psychologist, and then she went into a lot of spiritual work and became sort of quite an enlightened psychologist. And she contended that trauma arguably begins the second we're born. You know, we're in a nice, comfortable womb, where all our needs are met, and then suddenly, bright light, welcome to the world, little one. You know, and that arguably could be, you know, birth trauma. So So I Jill Edwards, her name was, if you remember her.
What was her name?
Jill Edwards. She's no longer with us, sadly.
Yes.
But she wrote some wonderful books.
Yeah, I do remember her, and I've read some of her books. Yeah, I thought she was brilliant.
I did too. Very ahead of her time.
Yeah, very definitely. So I kind of see trauma as 4 aspects.
Please.
And those 4 aspects are an aspect 1, which is something that's obviously traumatic. So rape, a war, tsunami, an event that people know is basically traumatic. That's your.
Is that so-called capital T trauma?
It used to be called big T and little t. We've done away with that now.
All right.
But yeah, you could call it the old terms of big T trauma. People basically
something that anyone could understand. You know, there's been an attack, an assault, a tsunami wave.
Yeah, and that's an aspect.
A pandemic, maybe.
Yeah. But what they don't understand is that there are 3 other aspects to trauma.
Go on.
So an aspect to trauma is when we grow up in an environment that in some way feels unsafe. Yeah. So we grow up with a dysregulated caregiver, or we grow up with a caregiver who hasn't processed their own emotional history, or who cannot be there as a co-regulator to our own burgeoning nervous system. So we know with children and children's developing brains that young children cannot self-soothe. They cannot self-regulate. They're not born with the apparatus to learn how to emotionally calm their own system. So they need an adult who can you know, smoothly co-regulate with the baby and the young child.
You
And
can give them mummy cuddles essentially.
and or daddy cuddles, and teach them how to ride the waves of the emotions that are in their own nervous system.
And not to make their emotions wrong, give them a safe space to express them. Because so many, I mean, I remember told loads of times when I was growing up, "Oh, stop that," you know what I mean?
Exactly.
You know, you need to say, you know, emotions are there to be honoured and processed. Even today, there's certain emotions I think, oh, I shouldn't be feeling that. You know, silly, but I know damn well I should sit down, be with it, feel it, and process it. You know?
Totally. Yeah. So all of that is an aspect to trauma, and also it's not just about you know, the caregiver being there and all the rest of it. It's about that neglect of an emotional scaffolder. You know, somebody not being there at all, or just not feeling safe within our own body mind system as a child.
It's interesting you say that. There's and I'm sure you've heard of him, Bruce Lipton. Who is a scientist, again, way ahead of his time, and he wrote this incredible book called The Biology of Belief. And he says he's on the leading edge. Okay, back in the 80s, I learned about genetics and how genes are dominant and all that sort of thing. Blue eyes, brown eyes. I was talking about it with my girlfriend's oldest daughter's friend, who's also here. And we both found genetics fascinating, but it's really moved on from there. There was a genetic determinism back then. It's basically saying if someone's got cancer in the family, you're probably going to get it too. But then it moved on to epigenetics, where they're saying, no, genes are actually just signposts that can be turned on and off. There's no guarantee. It's more the environment, or as Bruce Lipton put it, the perception of the environment. And it falls into, do I feel safe or am I in danger? Is it rest and digest? Is it fight and flight? Is it sympathetic? Is it parasympathetic?
Exactly.
And that's what Bruce Lipton contends. And I think he's absolutely right.
Yeah, I would agree with that too.
Absolutely right.
So then,
and he did some fascinating experiments. He got two identical sets of cells and put them in different environments, and they're stem cells, and they became different things in the Petri dish environment. And that proved that they were the same genetically. They were like identical twin cells. And yet in different Petri dish environments, they became different things. And that's just in a laboratory. I mean, that's mind-blowing, isn't it?
Yeah, that is mind-blowing. Amazing.
Anyway, back to you.
So that's an aspect 2. And aspect 3 is when our parents or those around us, normally parents, have unprocessed trauma themselves, or things like, we call them introjects in therapy, but it basically means if my mum or dad were scared of mice or flying or heights, I'm more likely to pick that up.
I've seen that. I've seen that dynamic.
Yeah. And then an aspect 4 is the grandparents and beyond. So it's the intergenerational story of the trauma that's lived throughout the generations and been passed down. But it's also what we call the collective, which is the soup that we grew up in. So did we grow up in poverty? Did we grow up with racism or sexism or homophobia? And all of that is the collective trauma. And very often people can have an aspect 1, an aspect 2, an aspect 3, and an aspect 4. And each of those aspects are in their own right traumatizing. And going back to
this whole race of people that don't feel safe to this day, other groups are picking on them. For example, we still have anti-Semitism today. You know, this is a whole group of people who've lived in, and not just the Jewish people, anyone, you could name anyone around the world, have lived in fear of other people. But again, it comes back to not being safe. It comes back to having to look over your shoulders. We're not safe. They're going to attack us. And we wonder why the world is so troubled, you know.
Exactly. It's because, you know, too many people in it are growing up with their nervous systems constantly in sympathetic, constantly activated, constantly feeling in danger. And also it's the beliefs, then going back to Bruce Lipton, it's the beliefs that we form about ourselves growing up in an environment where we are unsafe, because you know, firstly, a child can never blame the parents or say mum or dad or whoever are having a bad day, or the teachers, you know, got out of bed the wrong side. When we are kids, we're egocentric. And that basically
Meaning
means,
we take it all very personally.
yeah, we take everything that happens around us meaning something about us. So
Yes.
we get all of these beliefs about ourselves in the world that then become the tracks that we run down for the rest of our lives.
And then we kind of create lives according to those beliefs,
Yeah,
because I don't know if you subscribe to the theory that the universe mirrors back what we believe. So the universe is one big feedback system. So if you want to change the world, again, it starts with yourself. Change what you believe, and that's part of the healing journey, isn't it?
yeah,
And then the
yeah,
world reflects something else back to you.
yeah,
You know,
yeah,
it's not picking on you. It's a feedback system, if you like.
yeah, yeah. I think I have to be slightly careful with some of that with trauma, in that, you know, it's a feedback loop. I mean, people didn't create the trauma that happened
No.
to them. Do you know what I mean? So
Very
sometimes
much
that,
so. Yeah,
yeah,
there is a danger,
yeah,
and I found this as well when I started studying these subjects. Was
yeah,
ever since the film The Secret, you know, we all create our own reality, and it's like, well, hang on a minute, that's not my fault. You know,
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
what do we go back to the first amoeba? It wasn't my
yeah,
fault that happened. You know, and then I heard the phrase, "It's not your fault, but it is your responsibility," which is a
yeah.
slightly better way of putting it. And then
I think
my
that's,
favorite way of putting it was the sort of NLP way, where it was empowering yourself to be at cause of your experience rather than being at effect of it. So it essentially empowers you. So it's down to you, but in a good way. But it doesn't mean to say you were guilty in the first place. It's
no.
just that no one else can do it apart from you. So let's empower that individual.
Yeah. And I think we have
Yeah,
to be really mindful, because I think sometimes the law of attraction and some spiritual, you know, some spirituality can be a little bit shaming of people if
yeah,
they are in the victim mode. So how I like to see it
yeah.
is,
Got to be really careful there, because I
yeah,
found that.
yeah,
I found myself feeling ashamed, and I'm like,
yeah,
but you know, wait
yeah,
a minute, I wasn't told this rule of the game in the first place. Nobody bloody told me that. Why wasn't
yeah,
I told that when I was 3 and old enough to understand? Why,
exactly,
you know, why
exactly.
does it take some woman in America channeling some universal entity to, which is questionable anyway? You know, you know.
So I like to kind of say in therapy, really, or in the training, that we've got 3 basically ego states, you know, and all therapeutic models, mostly in some spiritual models, have the concept of parts. They dissect the psyche into, you know, whether it's mind, body, soul, or, you know, a trinity or a trilogy. Things are normally dissected. And in
Yeah,
therapy, we dissect things. I mean, Freud started it with id, superego, and ego. So now there are lots of different models that separate things out. And one of the separations is adult, wounded child or not okay child, and adapted self or critical self. You know, they're almost like archetypes or different parts. So with all trauma therapy, we work to a parts model. So what I am always saying to clients and students now of the voyage is, yes, we are empowering the adult self. Everybody has an adult self. And when I talk about the I and the I am self, that is my adult. However, we are also not negating the historical parts of somebody, because
quite.
everybody has historical parts. They've usually got, and I've never met anybody that hasn't got it on some level, a wounded part that is like a pre-10-year-old that believes, I don't know, I'm not good enough, or I'm unlovable, or I'm
Oh,
unworthy,
definitely,
or I'm
definitely,
bad. Yeah. And that's where the
definitely.
limiting beliefs come in. And
Yes.
then we've got this adapted or critical or sabotage part, normally that comes in around 11, 12, 13 as a teenager.
And I've heard that described as the inner critic. Would that be right as well?
Yeah, I prefer to call
It's trying
it
to protect
adapted.
you,
Yeah.
but it's
Yeah.
actually like a troll on your shoulder that will never say anything good, will never encourage you. it's like a baddie in a video game that will always catch you out. And
yeah.
I mean, after you, sorry.
Sorry, no, the thing is, you hit the nail on the head, is even though it's a baddie and like a troll and blah, 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 and it never has got anything good to say about you ever, it's actually trying to protect you, because it's trying to hide and keep the wounded part hidden and trying to keep people away. And it's trying not to activate any of those feelings or beliefs in the younger you.
Which would manifest, I would have thought, in very avoidant behaviors in the adult. Am I right?
Yes.
Which takes an awful lot of energy, an awful lot of time.
Yeah.
And what I've learned about healing, I've been on some fantastic calls with people and healers and really, really good spiritual people. And I've seen some wonderful inner child work done, actually. I saw this amazing thing where someone traveled on an imaginary timeline and healed the inner child, because you can't ignore it, you can't push it under the carpet. It needs a hug, it needs to be embraced, it needs to know it's safe. But they went back and healed the inner child and brought that safety of the feeling back into adulthood. And I swear 10 years came off them on this Zoom call.
And that is possible.
It was like 10 years of weight lifted. It was quite amazing, verging on miraculous. I would say it was incredible.
And we can do that. I am just mindful for everybody listening, or anybody listening, that sometimes it's not a one-time pony, i.e., yes, you can have a breakthrough moment. And yes, with the right healer or therapist or technique or seminar or whatever, you can have a real experience of reconnection with that younger part of you, where something quasi miraculous seems to happen, but usually it takes more than one go.
Oh, I agree. I mean, the same people do come back week after week, and then they bring something else the next week. It's definitely a process, a voyage.
It's layers. It's
a journey.
It's layers.
Yeah, that's why it's called. This book's called The Journey, or brilliant organisations called The Voyage. It's not called the one stop, the one hit wonder, is it?
No, although unfortunately there are people that are very popular out there that kind of give the impression that you can heal yourself in a weekend fully or in a week, no matter what trauma you've been through. And I'm sorry, but I'm too old.
Arguably, life it becomes a process of healing, doesn't it? And it's a wonderful journey. Not without it's not all sunshine and unicorns.
No, it definitely isn't. And really, the journey is that we're going back to meet those adapted and wounded parts of ourselves and heal them, and look at the beliefs that have been created and what's happening in the nervous system, and try and process it so that we can step even more fully into our adult self.
But we need a safe space, either with people around us or within ourselves, to be able to do that.
Yeah, we do.
And in a world where everyone's in continuous fight or flight, that's not the easiest thing to do.
No, it's really not. We have to find people that are not in fight or flight, that are in their adult, that are in what we call, us nervous system people, in ventral vagal. So there are three. Yeah.
Vagus nerve, explain.
Yeah, so the vagus nerve basically is Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory, which has been a bit of a godsend to the therapeutic community. I mean, there are some scientific people that are slightly dubious, but I found it nothing less than really helpful. So Porges' polyvagal is that, as you were saying earlier, there are the two branches. There are of the autonomic nervous system. There is the sympathetic branch, but there is also the parasympathetic branch. So the sympathetic branch is our fight or flight, is our activated, is our, I've got to be really nervous because I'm being eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. So that is our, run, fast, overactivated. And then we've got the parasympathetic, but the parasympathetic has not just got one branch. It's got one branch called ventral vagal. And the one branch is our rest and digest. It's our flow state. It's when we're in our adult, it's getting us back into, hopefully you and I are both in our ventral vagal at the moment. You know, we're calm, we're relaxed, we're connected. And in that place, we can be pro-social. So we can engage with others and all the rest of it. But the parasympathetic and the vagus nerve have actually got another thing that they do. So what happens is I'm in ventral vagal and I'm connected and I'm in green and I'm having a conversation with you, and suddenly there's a God Almighty noise outside and screaming, and my sympathetic system comes online and my heart rate elevates and I start to respond. And if the problem persists and the screaming gets worse, I can either stay in fight or flight, or my vagus nerve can kick in and put me into shutdown, where I basically come out of ventral vagal and I go into dorsal vagal collapse. It's called dorsal. And it's really how the system puts in a freeze and an immobilization response. So I either freeze, or on the other side of it, I just I collapse and I submit. And that is dorsal vagal shutdown. So what we see is a world where people call, what I call, is flip-flop. And what they do is they've got no ventral vagal adult energy. There is no green left. And what they do is they swing between sympathetic fight or flight and anxiety presentations. And then on the other end of it, they go into dorsal vagal shutdown, or they freeze, or they flop and collapse and duvet dive. And that is more of a depressive state.
I had a bit of a struggle with my mental health about 5 years ago. Second time in my lifetime. I feel pretty blessed. I mean, it's only twice in a lifetime. But and those symptoms, I sort of self-diagnosed as burnout. That doesn't sound a million miles away from burnout, does it? I just didn't want to do, and making a cup of tea seemed like the most monumental task to do. And that's dorsal vagal, is it? Duvet diving. That's it. That's it. And then there were very stressful moments as well. But that lovely parasympathetic, where the healing is, where the connection to the universe is, if we believe that. I believe all healing happens in parasympathetic.
All healing happens in ventral.
Is that the same thing?
Yeah. Well, it's the parasympathetic rest and digest, because the parasympathetic is also dorsal. Understood. But it's dorsal with the break.
I didn't know about this. I didn't know. It makes complete sense, because it was sort of a burnout, but it was a low energy burnout.
Yeah. So instead of
sympathetic, you expect to be high energy, but it wasn't. It was the low energy. That's really clarified it for me. That really makes sense. Yeah. And I get this feeling, this heavy feeling in my body, like I didn't want to do anything, and I didn't want to be social, and I didn't want to see anyone.
No.
And
can't
it was just,
when you're in that space. You really can't when you're in that space.
You can't. And also because of what was going on, but my mum was dying, and it was you know, and it's quite a busy thing when people die. There's a lot to learn, and I described it as a learning curve at the time. My mind and body was really ready for it. But you know, learned a lot through it, and here I am talking.
And there's probably been a lot of processing and a lot of grief and all the rest of it, and sadness that needed to come up and out.
Oh, there has been a shit ton. Absolutely. I'm feeling much sort of 90% better now, and but it was, you know, very difficult at the time. So I've got an awful lot of compassion for anyone that
it's going through it.
That's been through that. It really is the thing. It's got nothing to do with being weak, and it's got nothing to do, because that's what the inner critic will have you believe. That's what and I said something else you said earlier. When I was like that, it felt like to me there was a 5-year-old, a 20-something-year-old, and a 50-year-old all running round. In my headspace. And that's kind of similar to what you said earlier, the wounded one, the adult one, and the adaptive one. And it wasn't a democracy.
No. No. And it needs to be a democracy, because therapy is about getting them all around the boardroom table and listening to them all and seeing what it is that they want for the person and trying to get open dialogue, because no part is bad.
No, every part has a positive intention.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
I've got a really favourite phrase which I learned through doing NLP: good intention, crap strategy.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, exactly.
for example, my friend was in a lot of emotional pain and he nearly drank
Yeah,
himself to death. He's still with us, just about. But
yeah,
and the intention was good, to be out of pain, but the
yeah,
strategy was comorbid. It was damaging, very,
yeah,
very
yeah.
damaging.
So his
And
adapted takes over and it tries to put out the fires and everything that's going on in the
yeah,
wounded. But actually, as we know, you can't run away and firefight the fires. You have to turn towards them at some point,
mm,
because they're going to catch you up and they're going to burn you in the arse at some point unless you turn towards. You can't ignore stuff that's going on within your own system. And unfortunately, we're not taught that,
no,
you know.
no, we're not.
Yeah,
I'd say there's more awareness now, though. Surely, this
yeah,
is the whole thrust of your work, isn't it?
yeah,
It's
yeah,
teaching, it's giving people these tools to.
yeah.
I've written down a bunch of questions. I mean, can
Oh, yeah,
we?
yeah, please.
Do we? And any questions from the audience? Feel free to put them in comments.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so, first question was: do we all have trauma? I guess so, at some level. Yeah.
I think we've definitely all got limiting beliefs, and
Yeah.
whether they were created at a traumatic moment or not, I think that if we think that trauma is a dysregulated nervous system and probably limiting core beliefs, even though you might not feel like that's trauma, it is at some level. Let's treat it the same way that we treat trauma.
Great idea. I mean, I had a theory, and tell me if I'm right or wrong, that when the trauma comes up, it goes back to the age you were when the hose was first kinked.
Yeah,
So if something happened at 13, something happens when you're 50, and you suddenly feel like a vulnerable 13-year-old again. Am I
yeah.
right?
Yeah, totally
Yeah,
right. You've
I thought
dropped
so.
into that part and that memory.
I came up with that idea a few years ago. That did seem to be true
Yeah,
in my experience. So it's the adult meets the teenage Kevin.
yeah.
Meets the. um, can we self heal, and can we self diagnose, or is it always best done with a therapist? Does it depend whether it's so-called? I don't want to use the term you don't want me to use. So, what was the term? You don't use big T, small t anymore. What was the term you
No,
used?
I
Does it
don't know.
depend on the level of the trauma?
Yeah. I don't know whether there is a term really. There's the four aspects, but let me say this. Trauma mostly happens because it's relational trauma. Somehow we are traumatized more because somebody wasn't there for us. We didn't get co-regulated. We didn't get seen or heard or soothed or connected with around the time of the trauma. Sometimes if we have trauma and there are other people that have been through that same trauma and we are in a safe environment or system around the trauma, we don't experience the dysregulation in the same way because we are soothed by relationships. So really therapy and coaching and healing works to a degree because the therapist is the co-regulator of somebody's nervous system. So let me say, if somebody is mainly in sympathetic or dorsal vagal and they have little ventral adult energy, it's because they've got stuff to process historically. Things are going on. So my main job really is as a swimming instructor. So I am there to help somebody breathe and go back into their body and learn how to ride the waves of their own body system so that they can process whatever feelings or sensations are going on in the body. And people are usually, unfortunately, terrified of doing that because they haven't been taught how to swim. So they're using all these other strategies and coping strategies and drinking or self-harm or, you know, whatever it might be, shopping, overworking, because
Anything. Big an
cannot,
addiction.
they cannot go towards riding those waves.
I
So
mean, I remember saying to my coach at the time, I'm terrified of going back to that dark place. I'm scared I'll
yeah,
never get out.
yeah,
And he's like, you're not going to. Trust. Go with it. Sit with it.
yeah.
I'm here for you. And he was like the holder of the light to move towards.
Okay.
If you like, very much like your analogy, the swimming teacher. But that was a real fear for me. But 5 years ago, I would have gone, no, I'm not going back to that dark place. I will not go back there. But
No.
maybe that was stopping me healing, that attitude.
Yeah, because you know, the water and the ocean at the top of the surface is a bit dark, right? And it all looks a little bit scary going in there. But basically the therapist or the coach or the healer or whoever doesn't push somebody off the edge of the boat and go swim, go on, go back into the dark place. No, they go, here's some flippers, here's an oxygen mask, I'm with you, I'm the dolphin, we're going to swim along together, and I'm going to shine a torchlight down so it's not so deep and dark and scary, and you can actually see there are really nice bright coloured fishes down there. And I'm just going to get you used to not having the fear about going there.
I think this reminds me a little bit of Jungian work where they talk about the shadow. But
always the shadow. Everybody's body is always the shadow.
But there's also the golden shadow, which is where you when you go in and you get past the dark stuff and you see also, like in your analogy, there's really pretty fish, and you reclaim bits of you. It's all about reclaiming all of you, reclaiming and integrating the wounded bits and the wonderful bits that may have been left over the years for whatever reason. Maybe life just got too busy, and I suppose it's all a journey of knowing yourself and fully loving yourself and being a fully integrated human being. Well, it all comes down to self-love. Of course it does, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And I think that takes time. I think that takes time because people usually hate their parts. They can't bear their adapted, stroppy teenage part. They don't like the wounded, and they don't want to go towards all of those limiting beliefs and memories because they're just like, oh, God. So, yeah, the internal journey is the hero's journey. It's the
But that's where the gold lies, ultimately, the gold lies. Question from Mr. Graham Pack, who's being very well behaved today. He's normally the resident comedian. I normally end up apologising for him. Graham, meet my friend Lou. Is there much difference between trauma and extreme anxiety, asks Graham.
I would say that extreme anxiety probably comes from trauma, because I'd want to know what the extreme anxiety is about. There is something that's happened to create the extreme anxiety, whether it's a belief, whether it's an incident, whatever it is, something is in the system that's creating that extreme anxiety.
Do you have a morning routine that you do, like a power hour, as the American gurus would say? What's your self-care routine, if you can share a bit with us?
I'm usually up very early. I'm much better early morning than I am late at night. I mean, obviously, as you know, I haven't drunk or smoked or done anything like that for a couple of decades. I'm very into my meditation. I'm very into walking the dog every morning. I do nothing for the first hour other than meditate and come into the day.
Yeah, I mean, meditation, since I think Oxford University studied mindfulness, and then it became popularized thanks to Ruby Wax and people like that.
Oh, I've lost you.
Am I there?
Yep.
It was a wonderful book. It was a big green book by Danny Penman and Professor Mark Williams on mindfulness, but it was the Oxford study of mindfulness. And I think people had this perception of meditation that you had to go off to some monastery in Tibet and give up your whole life. And they're saying, no, there's science to it now. And science has caught up with what the Buddhists knew all these years ago. But the benefits of meditation, according to the teachers, it's just phenomenal. There's teachers saying, why isn't everyone doing this? It's so good. It puts you in parasympathetic, in ventral.
It does for some. So I think for trauma, we have to be really, really mindful. And back to your point of, you don't want everything to come up at once. So you have to learn with anybody with trauma or stuff that's in their body mind system, in the what we call the soma, the somatic, that we have to enter it very slowly. And too much meditation or too much mindfulness is too long a gap of them being in the ocean. So we want to put one foot in, one foot out, one toe in, up to the knee, up to the, you don't ever want to leave somebody for too long without their prefrontal cortex thinking brain online, because if they've got too much trauma and unprocessed material in their body, they're just going to drown in meditation. It's too much.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So meditation isn't always completely benign.
No, it's not for people with trauma because it's too long a gap, and we have to learn to titrate people with trauma. It's a bit like, the analogy is having a fizzy bottle of pop and you take the lid off too quickly and everything comes up. You are doing everything in trauma very slowly and very gradually, and
which
really
is in itself an act of self-love, I suppose.
Yeah.
But meditation can be beneficial at the right time.
At the right time. And listen, small incidents of staying with the body or calming down the thinking brain for 3 or 5 or 10 seconds is good. You just don't want to leave people for too long in it until they can swim. Yeah. Otherwise it's too much.
That makes sense. So if we meet someone who we think's got trauma, what's the best way to help them? Because I'll be very honest, I've been in relationships with people in the past who have been understandably very traumatized because I didn't have the training to deal with it, and it started to drag me down. So I had to go because I couldn't, and you don't want to abandon people, but at the same time, you don't want to be dragged down yourself. It's difficult. So what happens if you find yourself in that situation? What do you do?
I think it's about sending them somewhere or to somebody who isn't just a tick box trauma informed person, because it has become a little bit of a marketing ploy that everybody seems to have trauma informed.
I know, send them to you. That's what we do.
I am going to try this spring, Longie, to get the voyage out there to the general public. So at the moment I've written it, or I've started, the last 18 months has just been about teaching clinicians and coaches and counselors how to work better with trauma. So that's what the voyage has been aimed at.
And the next bit is to make it accessible to everybody. So there's an online resource. And you can just go there, and whichever bit they need, they can cherry pick the bits they need. And it's
they can't cherry pick because it's trauma. So what it will be is at the moment I've got 2 programs for coaches and clinicians. So I've got what I call a light dive, which is a 12-week program, and then I've got a deep dive, which is a 12-month program. And I think because of the nature of trauma, I will beta test in the spring of this year a deep dive program for the general public where they're in it for 12 months. They get 40 hours of video content. That's what I've done for clinicians. And then they get a weekly group where they come in a group, in a community, and we talk about each of the waves each month, because there are 12 waves of the voyage. So each month we do wave 1, wave 2, wave 3, and they both have a different healing. They all have a different healing agenda to each month.
Oh, that's interesting. There's an awful lot of power of people coming together in groups, though. I've noticed that before. A group dynamic can be so incredibly powerful. And that's where the breakthroughs. I'm not saying it's a one-stop. I'm not saying there's one breakthrough and Shazam, you're healed, but there are breakthrough moments along the way, and I've seen that in groups an awful lot of the time.
It does really work, and we've got, in each of the 12 waves there are 3 phases. So each phase of the voyage has 4 waves. So phase 1 is about landing in the sand. So phase 1 is about grounding, is about stabilizing, is about teaching about what trauma is, how it impacts the brain, about the nervous system, about parts and the adult and the wounded and the adapted part, but it's also about building up the adult. Like, who is the present moment self? Because we have to build that adult before we go into phase 2. So the first 4 months is all about stabilization. We don't go anywhere into the trauma. We don't speak about the trauma. We just don't go there until there's an adult on board.
Because you can't build a house without foundations.
No. And then phase 2 is, unsurprisingly, swimming in the sea. So it's about befriending the body, and it's about going into the nervous system and starting to be able to manage emotions and name them and feel them. And then put down any self-sabotaging strategies, learn about beliefs, learn about, how to put in boundaries, things like that are in phase 2.
Now, boundaries was a big thing for me because I was a people pleaser. I didn't want to say no to people.
I know.
But I have relatively recently put some pretty firm boundaries in with people.
Yeah.
Because if you don't, people will just take the piss sometimes.
Yeah.
I don't know if they mean to or not. I think this one did. But and you do have to put in firm boundaries sometimes.
Yeah.
It's not rude to say no.
No, it's definitely not rude to say no. So that's really an important part of trauma recovery, because a lot of people with trauma are people pleasers, or they're in a freeze response, or they can't find their voice, or they don't want to be rejected or abandoned, so they don't put in a boundary, or they're very codependent. So all of that. And then also in phase 2, we put down alcohol and other strategies used for coping, eating disorders, etc., because you can't learn how to ride the waves of the body if you're using. Doesn't work. And then phase 3 is about soaring in the sky. So it's like the inspiration stage of the voyage, because I believe that you can't do a mind and body program without including the soul and the spiritual. So in the voyage version of the Soar in the Sky, we look at vision. What's your vision now? Where are you going? Where would you like to head? What are you doing for a vocation? What's your purpose? What's your mission in life? Who are the vibe and the people around you? Who are your community?
I notice, interestingly, you talk about the importance of grounding. My teacher that I see online, he says the further up you go, the more grounded you need to be. It's like a bilateral journey, he says. If you go up further up, you've got to be grounded. He's all about grounding and all that sort of thing. You can't, if you're going to have your head in the clouds, you've got to have your feet on the ground. And he talks an awful lot about being in the body. He says we're all heads on sticks, and it's about getting out of your head, getting into your body, feeling and processing the emotions. There's a lot of commonalities with your work. So it's
and I've noticed that too, because otherwise, if you don't ground and stabilize and land in the sand, and you don't swim in the sea and go into the body and start to process emotions, what you do is you just soar in the sky. So many philosophies and things that I've done over the years, and I have to share some of them with you at some point, Neil. They've been quite funny and hysterical, are just sky programs, but they're like spiritually bypassing. Because, you can be all spiritual and up there and big picture and vision and all the rest of it. But if you're not in your body, none of it's embodied, none of it's processed.
Yeah, I know. And I've known people like that they've got paintings of angels on the wall, but my God, they're bearing grudges and things like that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's that kind of thing. And it's almost, Lou, I could talk all afternoon. It's been intriguing talking to you.
Good.
And I love the work you're doing nowadays. What a beautiful soul you are. It's been lovely to reconnect with you again.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. And it's just, if I could get the Voyage beta out there to the general public this year, my aim is at some point, Neil, to get it government funded. you know,
Brilliant.
so for 97 quid a month, you know, if the government would pay half, a tenner a week, in some way, shape or form in the next few years, you'd be able to do the voyage and get all of this information and healing that should be out there.
And the world needs it.
It
The world needs it
really
more than ever at
does.
the moment.
It really does.
Well, when you're closer to launching, come back on again, and we'll do
Okay.
like have a little. I'm sure I speak for Russ Kane as well.
Oh,
Come back on, have a chat with both of us, and we'll get a
yeah.
little bit for you. And if I can help in any other way in my capacity, please let me know.
Thank you.
And thank you for the work that you're doing. And it's been lovely to reconnect with you again. Thank you, Lou.
Lovely to lovely to reconnect. And please reach out and keep in touch and send
I
my
will.
love.
And likewise, don't be a stranger.
Yeah, I will do. I will do. All
Are you
right.
based in London? Are you in London?
No, I'm not. I'm in Hampshire now.
Oh, right.
Yeah, middle of a field. It's good for my nervous system. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah. All right.
Okay.
You take care.
TheVoyageAcademy.com if anyone would like to check it out. Thank you, Lula Ben. Nice
Pleasure.
to speak to you.
Pleasure.
Take
See
care.
you soon. Take care.
Keep in touch. Don't be a stranger.
I won't. Bye.
What an absolutely wonderful lady. And yes, used to work with her at Capital. It's amazing what we evolve into and what we become over the years, isn't it? Well, it is in her case, not so much about this one. But thank you for watching today. I hope you enjoyed it. Love you, huggy, squeeze you. Russ and the gang will be back on Friday with Chantal Ricard, Screen Queen, all the recommendations of what to watch. There's some really good stuff on our screens at the moment. She'll have all that information for you. Jonathan Baz, and of course the inimitable Phil Dave and Russ will see you on the Midday Show on Friday. But that's been your Wednesday edition. I'm Neil Long, and thank you. Good afternoon. Oh, we're still live. Bye-bye.